Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the masterclass on how to learn like a pro. There's a lot of people already in the stream. I see that there's people from Guatemala, Netherlands, Texas, Boston, Canada, a lot of people from Canada, actually. That's super cool. Somebody from Lima, that's awesome. So let's get started with a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our guest speaker. So first of all, if you have a question throughout the webinar, just pop it into the Q&A window. Last week in the first part of the masterclass, there were a ton of questions, and I'm very sorry if we didn't get to your question. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but of course, there is limited time, so we won't be able to get through everything. But feel free to just send us an email afterwards, and we'll see if we can get any questions to Olav after. So Olav is our learning expert, author, and public speaker, and he will give you the second masterclass today about Learn Like a Pro. Hello, Olav.
Hi. Are we all set?
Absolutely. I'll stop sharing and you can take over.
All right, I'll take it from here.
Perfect.
So good, then the screen should be sharing.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So excited to be back for the second part of the masterclass. I thought that we would start with an activity. So in this activity, I'm going to show you some different shapes. And I'm going to show you different numbers of these circles and the squares, triangles, and stars. And I want you to count all of them and keep the numbers in your working, keep these numbers in your mind, because I'm going to ask you about this later on. So I hope everyone understood the task. Just count the different shapes, and then we'll see if you can manage to do so. All right, let's just get started with this. All right, so the question is, how many did we see of each of the shapes? So I'm going to send out a poll question for this, and we can see if you manage to count the different shapes. Let's see. So far, 20% have answered, and we're up to 50%. All right, 70% have answered the question now. And we can cap it in 5 seconds. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll end it. So as you can see, 56% answered the third choice, 2, 4, 3, 4, and that was correct. Let's see if we can get this back up here. So for this small activity, you actually used a part of your brain called working memory. Now, working memory is a part of your brain that you use to hold on to information and manipulate that information. But it's all just very temporarily. You can't hold information in there for a long time. If you are familiar with how a computer is put together, you can think of your working memory as your brain's central processing unit, or CPU. Similarly, you could think of your long-term memory as your brain's hard drive. Long-term memory is where you have a lot of space to store things. Working memory is what you use to extract some of that information and do things with it or manipulate that information. Last week was all about long-term memory. We talked about how neurons are your brain's building blocks and how neurons come together to form sets of links. And this is where memories, knowledge, and information is stored for the long term. And if you want this to stick and not forget it, you have to create strong sets of links that don't easily break up. We also talked about 2 different learning systems that you could use to form these strong sets of links in long-term memory. And the word working memory came up, but we didn't actually speak much about it. But that's what we're going to do today. We will be focusing on working memory, a part of the brain that is essential for thinking and learning. We use it all the time, but it's often not very well understood. The content in today's masterclass is based on my latest book, Learn Like a Pro, and the accompanying online course with the same name, both which are authored and produced together with Dr. Barbara Oakley. All right, so long-term memory and working memory are quite different. Long-term memory has a lot of storage space, and actually a few years ago, engineers from Google estimated that if you read all the books in the world, all the books that have ever been written, and you wouldn't be able to do that because it would take so many years, you would be dead a long time ago. But if you were able to do that, and if you were able to memorize all of that information, it would only fill up about 5% of your long-term memory. So long-term memory is this vast space. You don't ever need to worry about it getting full. The challenge is more making sure that it sticks. But working memory, on the other hand, is extremely small. You don't have room for several books there, not even several pages. If you could fit in 10 words into working memory, you would have a pretty large working memory. And working memory is also very temporarily. I'd like to compare the two of these to an ocean. So think about your long-term memory as the ocean, and you could place a lot of things on the ocean floor. The ocean is large. And if long-term memory was an ocean, your working memory would be an octopus with a set of arms that it could use to pick up information and do things with that information. As I said, we use our working memory all the time when learning and thinking. So for example, if I asked you to take the number 7 and 14 and multiply them, you would be using your working memory. You might start to calculate 7 times 10 plus 7 times 4, etc. And as you are doing these mental calculations, your working memory is hard at work. If you are thinking back to an episode, or you're trying to think of a special formula or some special chunk of knowledge, you might also be using your working memory. It goes into long-term memory, try to find the relevant sets of information and bring it into its arms so that it can do things with it. Now, working memory can work quite well as long as you don't give it too much to hold on to. So in the first task that I gave you, it was 4 different numbers, and you did quite well. And that's something that the working memory generally can handle. But let's try another activity. Now hold on to the numbers that I present to you and try to keep them in mind. 8, 1, 4, 2, 5, 9, 6, 3, 2, 1, 5, 4, 9, 2, 7, 6, 5, 1, 8, 3, 2, 4. In this case, I'm just throwing a lot of information at your working memory, and it has no chance of holding on to all of it. So your working memory doesn't know what it should hold on to. And so what often happens is that it doesn't manage to hold on to anything. Sort of everything drops out of working memory. And you have difficulties remember what the first number was, perhaps even the last number. And when that happens, your working memory is overwhelmed. You feel frustrated. And if you are learning, well, no learning is occurring because your working memory is completely overwhelmed. So to function well in our learning and thinking, it's important that we don't overwhelm our working memory. So to see if the distinction between working memory and long-term memory is clear, I want to ask you a question, and that is, imagine that you are on vacation. You checked into a hotel, you get the key to that hotel. It says that your room is 201, and you go to your room. Then later you head out to have dinner. The key is in your pocket, but you don't need to look at it. As you approach the hotel, you remember that your room was 201. Now, in this case, does this information, 201, does it reside in your long-term memory or in your working memory? What do you think? This is a lot quicker this time. 70, almost 80% have answered the question so far. And we can end this in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 1, 3, 2, 1, and end. So most of you answered working memory, about 2/3. Well, of course, any information that you are currently thinking actively about is pulled into working memory. But you were not going through the entire day keeping that number 201 in your working memory, because that keeping things in working memory is something very effortful. Then you would have to go and remind yourself of it the entire day. So in this case, if you heard the number and 2 hours later you were able to recall the correct number, it was actually put in your long-term memory, but it was there in the form as a very weak set of links, some information that could very easily disappear. And most likely after 2 days or a week, it disappeared, but it was stored in long-term memory, because working memory is very temporary, perhaps only 10 seconds or 20 seconds or maximum 30 seconds after you stop deliberately thinking about it. And we'll soon look at how you can maximize your working memory. But before we do that, I thought that we should actually test your working memory. Now, long-term memory is so large, it doesn't make sense to test long-term memory, but working memory is quite limited, and it is a little bit different from person to person. Some have a large working memory and some has a small working memory. And there are several ways to test this. We're going to do a test where will be reading some sentences, and you will try to remember the last word of every sentence. So you will try to keep that in your working memory. So I will, for example, read that he was reading a blue book. Then you are trying to keep book in working memory. Then I read another sentence. 14 people were inside the supermarket. Now you have book and supermarket that you're holding in your working memory. And I'll continue reading several more sentences, and it's always the last word that you are to keep in working memory. When we are done with all of this, please input all the words that you were able to keep in your working memory in this form. You find this form if you go to wmtest.supers.no. I'll see if I can share that in the chat so you can click on it directly. And it would be great if you could go into that in a tab in your browser so that it is ready for when we have completed the test. Let me see here. wmtest.supers.no. And there we go. It should have been sent out to everyone. When you come to this page, you see it's just a simple form. It's just one text field, and that's where you'll enter all the words that you remembered. It doesn't matter what order you put these words in. It doesn't matter if you capitalize the first letter of these words. It doesn't matter if you separate them with a space or with a comma, but you have to spell the words correctly. And once you're done with that, you hit submit. If you don't remember any words, then you can hit, then it can be blank and you hit submit. That also happens, that things just fall out of working memory. But as we do the test, don't sit and write down as I read the sentences out loud, because everyone can do that and you will not be able to test your working memory. You have to keep it in mind, and once we're done, you write it down. The sentences that I read to you previously, they were just examples, so you can forget them. But when we start now, please keep the last word in every sentence in mind. So I hope you're ready. Let's go. We had been waiting for a long time. It was interesting, but difficult to understand. No one was carrying a backpack. We had just arrived when it started to rain. The office was just a small room. The coffee arrived late and it was cold. There were many bushes in the garden. He asked and he asked, but received no offer. All right. So the answers are starting to come in. And if you are done, you can see here how the results are coming in. I can So for those of you who had issues with the form, you can use this link instead. That should work. The reason that I use that other link is that it's a little bit easier if you don't have a clickable link, but you can use the latest one I just sent out. In any case, as you can see here, the results are coming in, and the average score is quite high. It's 5. And it is in line with what research is telling us, because research tells us that an average working memory is between 4 to 5. We can hold 4 to 5 words or 4 to 5 numbers in working memory. But of course, some people have a larger working memory. Some people have a smaller working memory. And there are some advantages with having oh, that's interesting. There are some advantages with having a large working memory. If you do, you can hold a lot of thoughts in mind at once, meaning you can think a little bit faster, you can solve problems a little bit faster, you can read a bit faster, and you will probably understand jokes a bit faster. If your working memory isn't that large, you probably need a little bit more time to think, to understand, to read, etc. But there are other advantages associated with having a smaller working memory. Researchers have found that people with a smaller working memory are typically more creative. They can think more outside the box and come up with original solutions to tricky problems. And perhaps since people with a smaller working memory needs a little bit extra time to learn material, they can often learn it much better and much deeper than someone who just quickly gets it. And of course, there are a lot of famous people who haven't had a large working memory. Albert Einstein, for example, was known for having a small working memory. And in this test, if you're only able to keep 1 word in mind or 0, it doesn't mean that you don't have a working memory, but information can very easily slip out of working memory as well, which is why it's so effortful to keep information there. You really need to focus. Many people wish that, or many people are interested in methods for training their working memory, to increasing their working memory capacity. Now, that is not possible. Working memory is pretty much set, but everything you use your working memory to is something that you can practice and get better at. So let's go back to the slides here. Right. And I'm sure you've also all noticed that kids, for example, they are not very good at keeping different thoughts in mind at once. And that's because when we are born, our working memory is very small, and then it develops with age, and around puberty, it sort of peaks. And then if someone has a smaller than average working memory, they follow the same trajectory, but it flattens out at a little bit lower capacity. Now, I said that you can't really increase your working memory, but everything you want to use your working memory at, you can improve. And the important keywords here are long-term memory. Whatever task you want to solve, you can use your working memory for. You can probably also use your long-term memory for. So, for example, if I am asked to speak about a random subject, I will be working hard thinking of what to say. My working memory will be hard at work, going into my long-term memory, trying to find some relevant pieces of information, seeing how I should present this, which order I should do it in, perhaps comparing different alternatives, and my working memory will be very overwhelmed, and it probably won't be very fluent. But if I had the time to prepare beforehand, I could think about what to say, I could practice it, I could develop these sets of links in my long-term memory. And then when I was going up to speak about that topic, I would just need one free arm in my working memory to access that set of links, and I could do it with much more ease. And of course, no matter how big your working memory is, you'll probably be in situations where your working memory is overwhelmed. When we learn to drive, for example, in the beginning, our working memory will look like this, especially if we just drive out on the road. There are so many things we need to do at the same time. We need to keep a distance, the right distance to the car in front of us. We have to mind the distance to the car behind us. We need to put on the signal when we make a turn. We need to mind the pace of the car. There's all these processes, and your working memory can't do all of them at the same time. And that is why we break it, driving down into smaller chunks. We practice starting and stopping the car. We practice making turns, etc. And then in the end, we practice doing it all at the same time. And when we've done that, we've obtained our driver's license. We've been driving for some time. Driving is an activity that we can do effortlessly, at least if there's not too much traffic. And that's because driving is a skill that is now stored in our long-term memory. Whenever we do that, whenever we drive, we don't rely that much on working memory. And our working memory will often be free to be used for other things. For example, carrying out a conversation with someone else. So one of the important takeaways here is that if you need to perform well in a task, be that a presentation, be that on an exam, you shouldn't rely on your working memory. You should build strong sets of links in your long-term memory beforehand, because long-term memory is almost infinite large, and it will be a much easier job for your working memory if you have these sets of links. And if you take an average class, for example, of students, some students will struggle to follow the material. Some students will not struggle so much. You know, for those students who are struggling, it's a very good idea, and it's very important to spend some time beforehand preparing, starting to build sets of links in long-term memory so that they can use them while they are following the lecture, so that their working memory isn't working as hard. And in the past, you know, professors used to say that students have to take notes in class. That's the best way to learn. And of course, if you are sitting in a class and you have free working memory capacity, it is a good idea to use that free capacity to take notes, because you can process the material even more while you're sitting there. But if you're sitting in a lecture or in a meeting and your working memory is already very overwhelmed, adding note-taking into the mix can make your working memory even more overworked, and you'll struggle even more, and you'll have to make this trade-off and decide whether you should focusing on taking notes or focusing on following the instruction. So a better advice actually is to see whether you can follow the instruction. If you can, taking notes is a good idea. If not, it can be better to wait until after the meeting or the class to take notes, or to take light keyword-based notes, or to borrow someone else's notes. All right. So let's look a little bit about how you can maximize working memory without overwhelming it. So one way you can sort of extend the capabilities of working memory is adding sets of links in long-term memory. Another way is actually to use pen and paper. Because if you put words down on paper, that becomes a sort of extension of your working memory. So you might have words, ideas that, if stored safely on paper, you don't need to keep them in working memory, and so you can have more capacity to think about other things. And you know, if you remember back to when you were solving math questions and you were writing down the steps along the way, this is what you were doing. You were always keeping track of where you were on paper, and then you were just thinking about the most recent calculation with your working memory. And so, for example, when I go to meetings or interviews or what have you, I always bring paper and a pen so that I can write down my ideas, thoughts, and questions along the way. That means that I don't need to think actively or actively keep those in my working memory. I can always use my working memory for what's going on in the moment. Researchers that are particularly interested in working memory and how to maximize it focuses on what strains working memory, or what overwhelms working memory. And this part of research is called cognitive load theory. And cognitive load researchers typically split the sources that give puts a demand on working memory into 3 different parts. So the first thing that that determines how hard your working memory has to work is the inherent difficulty of what you are learning or thinking about. So of course, 4 plus 4 will be a lot easier for your working memory than something a little bit more complex. The second part is how that information is being presented. Some ways of presenting information is very straightforward. It's very quick for your working memory to grasp, whereas other ways of presenting that information can be more difficult, especially if there's a lot of different colors, font sizes, if it's written in a very difficult way, for example. And generally, our working memory is much faster at grasping pictures, anything visual, than explanations using words. And the last part is, the kind of thinking or processing around this material that is being presented. So if you only have very shallow thoughts, then it doesn't demand so much about so much from your working memory. So for example, if you are talking about setting the right price for a product, and you think about how many letters are in the word price, then that's a very shallow form of processing that doesn't require much from working memory. But if you are thinking about, okay, what is the right price for this product, what is the different factors that we should consider, then all of a sudden your working memory is working much harder at a much deeper form of processing. And what researchers say is that if you want to maximize learning, what you should is that you should reduce any load on working memory coming from presentation, and you should increase the load coming from processing. Meaning that when you are taking in information, it should be as easy as possible to understand exactly what is meant. Reading, you shouldn't spend time having to decipher bad handwriting, because that puts a lot of pressure on your working memory, but it doesn't contribute much to learning. Whereas it's the good question, it's the good thinking processes that you should be using most of your working memory for. And so this is also good to keep in mind if you are giving a lot of presentations, or you're hosting a lot of meetings, because in a group, in a room with a group of people, some people will have a large working memory, but there will also be a lot of people that don't have a very large working memory. And the easier you can do it for them to understand what you're presenting, the easier it will be for them to grasp that material and think about it in a more deep way. So these are things that you have probably heard before, but I just wanted to present some rule of thumbs for presenting information in a way that doesn't overwhelm others' working memories. And I am kind of, and every time I see something like this, I'm a little bit shocked, because if you present information that is too hard to read, it's too much at the same time, working memory is just overwhelmed, and it's really hard to learn from that or think about something like this on a deeper level. So some rules of thumbs: present only one thing at a time. You might use a lot of words explaining something, but any words you show on a PowerPoint slide will compete with what you are saying. So you should use as few words as possible. And you should have a good structure, and telling others about the structure, about what you're about to present, will also make it easier for their working memory. And any type of visuals that you can use. If you can draw on a board, that's great. The brain and the working memory can grasp things much quicker that way than if you only use words. And of course, mind the pace you are using when presenting. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is what you do when your working memory gets stuck. So sometimes working memory isn't necessarily overwhelmed, but it just gets stuck. And I'll share a small story from when my working memory was a bit stuck. A few years ago, I was out in the park, and I was flying flying my drone, and I hadn't been flying my drone very much. So the wind got a hold of my drone and it took the drone into some big trees. And there the drone got stuck in between the thinnest branches. And here you can see a photo from where the drone was stuck. And more importantly, I felt stuck as well. I couldn't see how to get that down. My working memory wasn't overwhelmed, but I just couldn't find a solution because I couldn't chop down the tree. This was in a park. I couldn't climb up. It was too high up, too dangerous. I couldn't reach it by ladder. I didn't want to call the fire department. And I couldn't reach it by throwing up a tennis ball or a stone. So I felt mentally stuck. My working memory couldn't help me find a solution. And it happens quite often that we get stuck. You probably have noticed this several times. You might see a person and you know that person, but you can't remember the name. And you send your working memory into long-term memory to find that information, but it just can't do it. And that's often what happens when we get stuck. We might have the information might be in our long-term memory, but we are not looking at the right spot. Or perhaps we need to combine different chunks of knowledge, and our working memory just can't do it. And sometimes you will see people sort of bashing their forehead, and this is typically where the working memory sits. It sits in the front of the head and sort of work a bit better, work a bit faster. But what you need in these situations isn't your working memory. You need something else. You need what neuroscientists call the default mode network. You can actually think of that as your brain's drone, something that can fly over long-term memory. It can see where information is stored, and when it finds that information, it hands it over to you. And you probably noticed this as well, that you might be struggling to remember a name and then you forget about it, and half an hour later it just falls down from the sky. In that case, your default mode network has been working for you in the background, and it's this drone that keeps flying around. In our book, we call this the diffuse mode, and this mode works best if you are not using your working memory actively, but if you instead take a break, go for a walk, or do some activity that you can do automatically without involving working memory. For example, taking a shower or brushing your teeth. And when my drone got stuck in top of the tree, that's what I did. I stopped focusing on it. I let my working memory rest, and then I just went on with my day. And several hours later, this diffuse mode had been working in the background, looking for a solution, combining different things, and it just handed it over to me. And the solution that we came up with was to use a bow and arrow, because you can shoot an arrow pretty far if you have a good bow. And then we attached a fishing line to the end of it. So we could shoot a fishing line over the thin branches where the drone was stuck. Then we could attach a thin rope to the end of that fishing line and drag that over this thin branch. And with a thin line over the branches where the drone was stuck, we could stand on the ground and shake these thin branches until the drone fell down. And it was a very elegant, very cheap solution. It was a quick solution, but it was a solution that I couldn't think of right there and then myself. I needed help from this diffuse mode in the brain. So oftentimes when we are struggling with something, we like to really solve it before we take a brain break. But it can oftentimes be more effective to do the opposite, to sort of give up in the middle of a struggle, take a break, and then rather return to it a little bit later, because that will give your brain's diffuse mode the opportunity to work with this in the background. You can also use this when you're learning. If you're learning something that is easy and something that's difficult, many people would then focus first on all the easy stuff, then move to the difficult stuff. But an even better thing can be to use the hard start principle, meaning that you start with something that is a little bit hard, you use your working memory, you focus on that, but then you move to something a little bit easier. Because while you are focusing on what's easy, your brain's diffuse mode can work in the background on what is a little bit harder. You can also use this when you are hosting meetings, for example. Say you have an agenda and there's one point of the agenda that is really hard. You don't know if you'll be able to solve it in the meeting. spend a few minutes in the beginning just talking about it, have everyone thinking about it, and then move to the other points on the agenda. Because while you're talking about the other points, the brain's diffuse mode can work on this one hard point. So, all right, to sum up these two master classes, we started last time talking about what happens in the brain. When you learn, you have to create these strong sets of links in long-term memory. And you can do that by using retrieval practice, space out learning sessions, let curiosity drive you, and learn both declaratively and procedurally. And if you didn't watch the first part of the masterclass, you can watch the recording from that. Today, we focused more on working memory, and we talked about how it's important that you don't overwhelm working memory, but that you should maximize it. And a good way not to overwhelm it is to make sure that you have built strong sets of links in long-term memory that you can use. You can also extend working memory with paper. You should break difficult tasks into smaller chunks so that your working memory can wrap its arms around it, and minimize cognitive load when presenting information. And you can use these principles for that. And at the end, we saw that if your working memory is stuck, it can't solve anything. You should take a break or focus on something else and then return to it later. If you want to dive into more of these kind of things, I'd recommend you to check out our online course or book. And we've also launched several mini Kahoots about this that you can find on this URL. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. And let's see. So there's one question here. When we try to remember a to-do list, is that working memory? So in that case, if you're trying to remember what you wrote down previously, you will be using your working memory to go into long-term memory to see if you were able to place it there. So you are using your working memory, but you didn't store the entire to-do list in your working memory. And then how does it work when English isn't your first language? Does this affect your working memory? Absolutely. Because if you are not if you don't know a language very well, your working memory will be working very hard thinking about, how to pronounce certain words, finding the right type of words. Whereas when you're speaking in your mother tongue, the words themselves flow automatically. You just have to think about what to say. In a foreign language, you also have to think about the words themselves and the right translations, etc. How does age impact working memory? For example, if your working memory was large as a young person, will you lose that over time? So I mean, generally around puberty, that working memory peaks, but I think when you get very older, working memory will be a little bit slower than when you were younger. The advantage of old age is that you can have stored a lot of information in your long-term memory, and that will make it easier and quicker to learn new things. So for example, if you have learned a lot of languages, you've been through that process many times, and then you're learning another new language in old age, that should be a little bit easier because you can draw on so much experience from your long-term memory. All right, when taking a course such as this one, how do we actively pass information from working memory into long-term memory? Well, the trick is to actively think about what has been presented and try to tie that into other things that you know before, and perhaps, ask yourself questions and try to resonate what the answer might be, or look it up. If you only keep things in working memory, no learning happens. And so, if you are transcribing something, or you are transcribing, so you have one set of paper and you're just writing down sentence by sentence, your working memory is working very hard. All the words flow into your working memory, but it doesn't go into long-term memory, which is why simply copying a set of someone else's set of notes doesn't help you learn that very well, because you don't send working memory, or you don't work at actively placing that information into long-term memory. Any tips for avoiding the loss, if indeed it happens, of working memory? What about tips for accessing long-term memory? So the good thing about long-term memory is that if you learn something really well, you don't actually need working memory at all. It becomes internalized. It becomes a part of you. just as when you're speaking your native language, you aren't really using working memory very much. So if you use, and we talked a little bit about this last week, we talked about procedural learning and the things that you learn procedurally, such as, riding a bike, tying your shoes, brushing your teeth. These things generally don't use working memory. And if there is, say you're giving a presentation, if you really practice it well over and over and over in different contexts, you develop strong sets of links, you can hold that presentation almost without using working memory. All the words will just flow, they will come naturally. It does take time to develop such strong links in long-term memory, but for certain type of activities, it's definitely worth it. Right, sorry I was late. Wonder if it's possible to have the recording. Yes, it is. The recording from both this session and last week's sessions is available and will be made available. Some people remember names of people they meet and some do not. Is this all due to how well the working memory works? Well, typically, people who are good at remembering names, they are good at immediately making those names meaningful, perhaps associating them to other people that they know with those same names, or they are repeating them in their mind, so they're more active. Last week, we talked about how retrieval practice, testing yourself is good for building strong sets of links. And if you meet someone new and you think actively about that name in the conversation, you say their name out loud 3 times, you think about someone else with that name, etc., it will stick better. But it is because you are placing that in long-term memory, you're integrating it better with other knowledge that you have there. And of course, if you have a really large working memory, maybe it's easier for you to do that if the working memory is smaller, but you can Google this online, tricks for remembering names. It usually boils down to ways to place those names in long-term memory. Do you have exercise to help develop working memory and long-term memory? So there's a lot of there's a lot of things that you can do, and you can build an unlimited set of links in long-term memory. And the more you know about a subject, the easier it is to learn other things. So if you want to become an expert in the field, just start learning. It will build and compound. You generally cannot train working memory itself, but anything you use working memory for, you can practice with. So typically in IQ tests, there's a lot of problem types where you're using working memory actively. But if you practice these over and over again, or perhaps you're doing Sudoku, then you can become better at it. But it's because you're building these helpful structures in your long-term memory. You aren't actually practicing working memory itself. Working memory and note-taking. Does doodling on paper or manipulating a physical toy help some people focus and keep ideas and thoughts in working memory? Well, the good thing about note-taking is that if you are struggling to focus because it's a little bit boring, or you're so easily drawn to other thoughts, taking notes can help you focus on what you are doing. And sometimes I've seen people sit in a class and they'll be knitting, and they can do that while still focusing. And but in that activity, they aren't using that much working memory because they've been knitting so much. It's an automatic process. So you can still keep yourself a little bit engaged and then use most of your working memory to focus. Does using the strategy of associating the words to each other rather than just memorizing them convert working memory use to long-term memory use? Well, as soon as you associate one word with other words that you tie it to experiences you already have in your long-term memory. And that is why it isn't a universal tactics to just think of whatever you already know that reminds you, or that is associated to the new material that you're trying to learn. All right, there's a lot of questions and we won't be able to do all of them, but I'll answer 2 more questions. So one question here is, any thoughts on mnemonic devices? And yes, I do have some thoughts. In this exercise, the working memory test that I gave you, if you use some kind of special technique where you were coming up with an image for every word that I said, or you tied it into a funny story or something like that, that's great. You succeeded at that task. In that case, you weren't actually purely using your working memory. you were getting help from long-term memory, images, experiences, things that were stored there, and you started integrating it with your long-term memory. So mnemonic devices are great because they take advantage of things that we already know in our long-term memory. And there is one technique that memory experts or memory athletes use in particular that is called the memory palace, and you can look this up online. That's a technique that you can use to take a lot of information quickly, 1,000 digits or 52 cards in a deck of cards, and memorize the order. But it isn't because your working memory is huge, has 52 slots. It's because you have this system of images, and as the cards or the numbers come in, you immediately integrate them and place them, associate them to different images. And then one more question. I don't know if this is a joke, but perhaps it's not. I seem to be able to remember. I seem not to be able to remember things that my wife says to me. Is this called selective hearing? Well, if you don't pay attention to anything, it doesn't enter working memory. And sometimes you need to pay attention. You need to spend some effort actually focusing on something. And so if you are sitting in a class and all the words are in the room, but you aren't actively focusing on it, it doesn't enter working memory, and it will not enter long-term memory. And with that, I want to thank you for participating today, for all the great enthusiasm and questions. And I wish you a fantastic evening or day, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much, Olav. That was super interesting. So I'll just share a couple of links for everyone so they know where to get their information. So first off, like Olav said, thank you so much for attending. It was super interesting, just as last week's session. So if you want to rewatch this session or watch last week's session, go to kahoot.com/learnlikeapro. And don't worry if you don't want to keep this this link in your long or short-term memory. We will send you an email with the recordings. And the recording for today's session will be available starting from tomorrow. If you want to check out Olav's Kahoot collection, just go to log into your Kahoot account and click on the Discover page. And if you want to see his full course, go to edx.org/course/LLAP. So with that, thank you so much for attending. I hope you had a great time. If you're interested in more content from Olav, we do have a lot of his blogs on our blog. Just go to kahoot.com/blog and search for Olav. You'll find all his readings. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Thank you, Olav.